Welcome to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love, hosted by Richard Osler. My guest on today's podcast is my friend Clare Marshall. Welcome to the podcast, Clare.
Hi, Richard. Hi, thanks for having me.
And Clare is calling in from England. In fact, she's calling in from Warrington, England, which is a city I served in my mission way before Clare was even born. And Warrington, for any of you that are curious, is about halfway between Manchester and Liverpool in northwest England. Is that about right, Clare?
That's exactly right. I couldn't have said it any better myself, Richard. So your memory serves you well.
So Clare has this beautiful British accent, and I'm going to be nostalgic the whole podcast, thinking I'm actually in England eating fish and chips in a Warrington fish and chip place after a long day of tracting, but I will keep in the present. But just as way of introduction, Clare is active LDS. She is in her mid-20s. She grew up LDS and served a mission in Frankfurt, Germany from 2012 to 2013. She currently serves as the first counselor in the Ward Relief Society Presidency in the Warrington Ward. And I wonder if I've been in that building. And Clare has stepped in this space, the same space many of my listeners are on, and I'm in, as being active LDS and talking about LGBTQ, and works right now for a charity, an LGBT charity. Just as a way of starting, tell us a little bit about that charity, Clare.
Yeah, so the charity is LGBT Foundation. It's based within central Manchester. And they support lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans people across the whole of Greater Manchester. We have a couple of projects in London, and we have a helpline, and 1 in 20 of our helpline calls are international. So it's quite a substantial charity. We have a men's program, a women's program, a trans program. We have sexual health teams, substance use support programs. The program that I'm on is called Pride in Practice, and my job is to go out and provide training to GPs, so that's general practitioners, doctors, nurses, dentists, optometrists and pharmacists on the specific health needs of LGBT people and best practices within the UK to support LGBT people so that their health equalities improve and that they receive better standards of care. Because we know that statistically LGBT people face higher prevalence rates of certain conditions compared to the general population. So it's a very unique charity, and very grateful to be involved in that work and involved in particularly a project that is backed by the government, funded by the government, and has a lot of progress and a lot of development happening at the moment. So really feel like we're on the forefront of seeing the reality of people's lives within the UK who identify as LGBT, and trying to make a positive impact and change to the services that they access within healthcare as well. So
that's really cool. Walk our listeners through your education background and kind of how you've connected with this foundation.
Yeah, so originally I studied a bachelor's in surface design. And then I went on my mission, and when I finished my mission, I came home and I studied a master's in art psychotherapy, which is using art as well as talking therapies within a therapeutic environment to help people through a therapeutic process. And there's lots of case studies and advantages to that. And the way that I ended up working with the LGBT community was that in your master's program, there's 2 years. 1 year you focus on a placement with children, and 1 year you focus on a placement with adults. And in my second year, I was assigned a placement in an LGBT Health Centre in Edinburgh. And you weren't allowed to refuse the placement, so you had to accept it wherever it was and regardless of location. And you had to, because it was your final year placement, not only were you having to work there or carry out your placement hours and your clinical practice hours, your dissertation had to be focused on that topic area and one of your clients. So I went from what I thought, now I look back and see, actually, I probably had a bit more experience than I realized, but I went from 0 to kind of, 110% thrown into the deep end of suddenly working with clients who identified as LGBT, providing different events, supportive and therapeutic activities, and studying a variety of literature that I never would have thought that I would be studying as part of my dissertation and studies. And so that experience was fundamental in helping me to gain the knowledge and the experience and skills required for my current role. And so it led into that.
When you graduated, did you know you wanted to work from a career standpoint with LGBT people?
By the time I finished my master's, it was definitely an area that I felt that I strongly wanted to work with. And I had this sense of, I would like to, but I don't know how. Everyone kind of finishes their degree or their period of study, whatever it is, and there's that period of, oh, okay, now I'm in the real world. What do I want to do? And you change your perspectives and your experiences change you. So who I was at the start of that 2 years master's compared to at the end was different. And I left definitely feeling like it was an area that I felt very connected to, very inspired to go into, initially not knowing how. And so there was a period for about a year or so where I kind of, was unsure how to get into this line of work based on the opportunities that were available at the time and where I was living. But it was something that constantly felt important and kind of within my thoughts and within the things that I pondered about. And that led me to various discussions with friends and initiatives that I'm part of. And so, definitely by the end it did, but I would have never have foreseen, at the start of my master's that where I'd be working today is where I'm working. It seemed two completely different worlds apart. So it was definitely a change that happened and a learning experience.
So that's great. Yeah. And I think what we'll do now is we'll kind of end the podcast again, coming back to what you're doing now. And I think it's good for our listeners to kind of know where you are now. But now I think we want to go back to kind of I'll ask you some questions about growing up. And I can't remember if I mentioned this to our listeners, but Claire offered a wonderful prayer before we recorded. And both of us pray that there's a good spirit here. Both of us are active LDS. And most of us have stepped in the space of using the principles of our church to talk about how we minister and help and lift burdens of LGBTQ people. And both Claire and I probably have at times found that took some effort on our parts to kind of understand this space. But I sense a lot of our listeners, maybe they understand more than me, but it's really the space that's free to occupy. We can do both. We can be supportive of the church and LGBTQ people. Sometimes it creates a little tension. Sometimes we get criticized or people question our motives, and we'll talk and see if you've felt any of that. But it's really cool just to connect with you, Claire. Claire and I don't know each other. Someone connected us, and so we're just really visiting for the first time on this podcast as I'm having flashbacks of my mission in Warrington. And I won't bore my listeners with my mission in Warrington. I'll save that for a separate podcast. But talk about, did you grow up LDS? Just talk about your home life growing up.
Yeah, so I grew up in a family that were active within the church. My dad was a convert, and my mum had basically grown up in the church. Her mother joined the church when she was young. Her dad never joined, but she was essentially raised in the church and baptized around about the age of 11. And so they were both, they met and they got married, and I followed a couple of years later. And so the church was always something that was a strong part of our life. And when I think of my parents, I think of most strongly their example within a church context. Both of my parents always held callings, were at with a typical at every single church event, left last, tidying up the chairs, doing their visiting and home teaching every single month, very, very active within the church. And I was grateful that they provided lots of opportunities to study the scriptures, to learn the gospel. They were very keen to teach us the principles of the gospel and allow us the space to come to our own conclusions. They acknowledged this is, what they felt was true, and therefore they taught us what they knew, but we ultimately had to decide for ourselves. And so I was grateful for that, because it meant as a young person, as a youth, I didn't feel pressured to go to church. I wanted to go to church because it was a positive environment, and I was grateful for that. But I do look back, and with that said, I think now looking back, there are many questions that I had that weren't answered within the home, and maybe this will answer some of your other questions. But I grew up in a ward that was a relatively small to average size, maybe 70 or 80 people, but there weren't too many of us within youth, and within my age group or class group within youth and primary, there was about 3 to 5 of us, depending at what point within my childhood were active and in the ward. And there was, we moved into the ward when I was 7, about to turn 8, and one of the other primary children, a year younger than me, from as long as I can ever remember moving into the ward, wanted to transition from female to male. And so growing up, my church life was a mix of the teaching of my parents, and then seeing, as we got older, some of those theories being questioned or challenged within the ward because of how the ward responded to this particular individual. And I look back now and I see actually that wasn't addressed by my parents or by the ward as well as it could have been done. I also know that there probably was very, very limited resources to those church leaders. So they probably didn't know how to navigate that situation. And so as I got older and now I reflect back, I'm like, actually, there's quite a few things that we didn't talk about that I wish we had discussed or had those more open conversations. And so I hope to be able to facilitate those kind of conversations with friends and with family myself. And obviously the environment that I work in is a catalyst for that as well. So I don't know if that answers your questions or confuses you and gives you more questions, to be honest.
So it sounds like your first real exposure to an LGBT person was a transgender person in your own congregation there in England.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Maybe you had friends in school and stuff like that.
Yeah, so my uncle was actually gay. He left the church and he died when I was 6. So I guess in the background, there was a context of, I knew that he was gay. Therefore, there must be other relationship lifestyles than just the heteronormative that I was taught at church or maybe saw immediately within my family. But again, that wasn't an area that was hugely discussed. Certainly not by my grandparents because of the stigma, and obviously not navigating that as a young person with my mother. So I think that was in the background. There was awareness that there are different lifestyles that people lead, but certainly, yeah, more of an immediate exposure or continual exposure was with this other young person within my ward who identified as trans.
How did was this young person approximately your age, and how did this young person do over time?
So they were about a year younger, so almost in the same classes the whole way through. They eventually went on to transition socially and medically and surgically to the gender that they felt most reflected them, so transition from female to male. And they are now married, and I believe relatively happily married. As we got older, we kind of drifted apart just by nature of, going to different colleges and things like that. But certainly their family is still within my parents' ward, and my brother was best man at their wedding. So, they have developed into the person that they felt they were and most reflected them, and living the lifestyle and the relationships that are significant to them.
Will you give us some trans education? Neither of us are trans, so we should have trans, and I do have podcasts of trans people giving us trans education, which is the best, but you're using they, and your talk. So just kind of, if I were a brand new person kind of wanting to learn vocabulary and just kind of trans 101, which is maybe an American term to describe the basics, give us some of the things that you would share with our listeners.
Yeah. So trans is a really big umbrella term. So trans essentially identifies anyone who identifies with a gender different to the one they were assigned at birth. And then if you imagine trans as a big umbrella, and then underneath that are lots of further identifiers. So trans man, trans woman, non-binary is also almost its own umbrella underneath trans. So if someone identifies as non-binary, maybe they identify as both male and female, or they might identify as neither male nor female. And so we're starting, if we're starting to look at non-binary and trans and gender non-conforming communities, it's starting to look at gender as, maybe a scale or a spectrum, not definitively male or female. And so my advice would be, if you are with someone and you don't know how they identify their gender, to use gender neutral pronouns, so they and them. And then if they would prefer you to use a gendered pronoun like she or her or he or him, they can tell you that. But by using gender neutral language at the start means that you're not making assumptions about an individual's gender, and actually allowing them the autonomy to say, this is how I identify, this is the label or the language that I feel most reflects me and my identity. So that is kind of the bare basics, but it does get a bit more complicated than that. And I don't know if you've covered non-binary identities in your previous podcast.
No, not too much. Talk about non-binary.
Mm-hmm. Do you say you want to talk about non-binary, or you've not?
Yeah, do. Go ahead and give us some one-on-one on that.
Yeah, so just as I was saying, it's starting to look at gender as a spectrum. So most things within our society presume that you're male or female, right? That it's one or the other as an option. And so non-binary people may identify in a variety of ways. It could be gender fluid, gender queer, agender, gender non-conforming, non-binary. There's as many terms for non-binary people as there are non-binary people, because it's an individual experience, it's a personal experience. So it's starting to move away from this binary concept that an individual is exclusively male and exclusively female, and actually saying, look, how I identify my gender is a mix of different things. Our identity is made up of lots of different things. It's made up of our gender, our religion, our culture, our socioeconomic status. So our identity is really big, and our gender is one element of our identity. And maybe for some individuals, they don't feel that their identity is solely female only or solely male only. And we're starting to look at looking at stereotypes, cultural norms, gender biases, things like that. So it can feel perhaps a bit overwhelming or challenging to someone that's never come across any of these words or concepts before, or has never even thought about their own gender, and thinking about, well, how do they define their gender? Because most people will be assigned a gender at birth, and as they get older, will just presume that that gender is the right gender for them, and never really give it any thought as to whether or how they feel about their gender, or how they might like to refer to themselves or their gender. So it might seem a bit overwhelming, but I think that's because it's starting to look at gender from a different angle to what we've traditionally looked at it as within the Western world for several decades or hundreds of years. There is quite a substantial amount of research around non-binary identities or trans identities or a third gender in non-Westernized societies and Indigenous communities as well. So that's something that supports and is often used when people are discussing the history or legitimacy of non-binary communities or trans communities as well, which is actually really quite interesting. If people are intrigued by that, go and do some research, because I think it would give you some interesting reading.
That's very helpful. You know, for traditional Latter-day Saints that are trying to reconcile as they learn about this space with our doctrine of gender identity, or the gender is eternal, and sometimes they feel conflict there. Do you personally have a way to reconcile that, or do you have conversations with Latter-day Saints that are trying to fit all of everything you just taught us about with the doctrine of our church?
I don't know if I have fully reconciled all of these elements myself, and to be honest, I don't know if I can, just simply because the more that I work in this environment, the more I study, the more my awareness and knowledge expands, and that then causes you to reevaluate all of the previous conclusions that one makes. In terms of, you know, as you were saying about gender being eternal, and I presume that you're referencing the family proclamation there. I remember having one conversation with my dad about it, and that was it. It was never spoken about after that conversation, and he had said, well, basically the person within my ward, they, despite transitioning their gender, were very vocal about the fact that they believed in the church, they believed the principles of the church were true, they had a testimony of the church, and that they felt that gender was eternal, but that the gender that they were was just different to the physical body that they had on the earth. And that for me as a young person, as someone in youth, was hard to reconcile, because you had someone that was, you know, testifying quite, you know, sincerely and emotionally to the truths that they felt were true to them, and that they felt they knew, and yet it felt that the actions, or it was perhaps perceived that the actions of that individual was almost violating the very principles that they were testifying of, and this was something that I look back and I think that wasn't really addressed within our ward, and that is hard for youth to reconcile. When I'm sat in a young women's lesson and we're being taught, you know, gender is eternal, family proclamation, your divine nature as a woman, and an individual in the class is sat there wearing a suit, asking to have male pronouns and a male name, but it's not being addressed. That does cause some questioning or some conflict. And so I spoke to my dad one day and I said, I don't know how to reconcile this. And he was like, I don't know either. Maybe when people are assigned, you know, to come to Earth, there are some people that are just so eager to receive a body. They're like, I'll accept the next body available. And, you know, and so they take it and maybe it doesn't align with their spirit. And he was like, but I don't know if that really, you know, he was like, that's the only working theory I can think of. And I don't even know how much I believe in that. And then the conversation ended. And so we never reviewed it. We never discussed it again. And so it did raise a lot of questions. And I have since met at least one other trans person that was a member of the church, now no longer a member of the church, who again identified that they agree with many principles of the church, but feel that their gender is eternal and their gender is just different to the one they were assigned at birth in this mortal life. And so I'll be honest, it's not an area that I have answers on, but I've reconciled in the sense that we live in a world where we have really, really diverse experiences, and I don't know what it's like to identify as trans or non-binary because I don't identify as trans or non-binary. But if someone does, they're entitled to that, and they're entitled to feel acknowledged and loved and affirmed in the way that they feel is most appropriate for them. And so in that sense, I reconcile it, but I don't have an answer I could give you on that question. I don't even know if there is an answer that
that's as fine.
I would receive in this life, at least, you know. So
that's as fine an answer as anybody's ever given me on this podcast regarding that question, and it just is. I just try to do what you do, Claire. If someone identifies as trans, I don't make them jump through hurdle to prove that to me. It costs me nothing just to let them, for me to use the pronouns that they would like me to use, the names that they would like me to use. I don't wonder, just like you don't, if they've had the surgery or how far they've transitioned. To me, there's a doctrinal principle that works for me is love my neighbor and do unto others as I would have them do unto me. And so I just put my arms around trans people, and I don't know their experience. It can be kind of scary, and it pushes the envelope for me on what gender identity is, but I've learned to listen to people and validate how they feel, because that to me is part of my doctrine as a disciple of Christ, to not add to someone's burden, but to lift their burden and help minister to them. And then, you know, sometimes we just live in these paradoxes where I believe in the proclamation in the family that gender is eternal, and then I hear individual experiences, and sometimes I think, well, maybe there isn't a paradox there, that gender is eternal. And sometimes I think maybe there is a paradox here depending on the person and their feelings about gender. So I think a lot of our Latter-day Saints want to engage in the very thing you just talked about, and talk about that in our congregations, in our families, and think of a framework to reconcile this as we become more aware of trans people. And it certainly humanizes it when we know a transgender person. That's what changed for me, is I had to meet trans people to learn about trans people. I couldn't just talk to cis people to tell me about trans people, and you understand that. And,
yeah, exactly.
And so that's when everything shifted for me, and I just felt like you did with this transgender person in your ward, a human there with a deeply personal experience about how they were feeling, and it cost me nothing to validate how they felt. So any more thoughts on that before we move on?
I don't think so. I mean, there's other random thoughts that I have, but I don't think they would be coherent probably at this time. I think let's move on.
I don't know if you have a perspective of the difference between the church in the United States and the church in England regarding the number of LGBTQ people that identified. And maybe it's just I sense there's more people, and maybe this isn't in the church, I sense there's more people in society in England identifying as LGBTQ compared to the States. Is that true? And maybe you don't know that.
I don't know that for certain. So some research suggests that within the UK, as many as 5 to 7% of the UK population identifies as lesbian, gay, and bisexual. and that about 1% of the population identifies as trans. There's research to suggest that if we were including non-binary people within those statistics, they would be slightly different. But the process in the UK in terms of regulating and research and kind of establishing statistical numbers of people that identify as LGBT isn't standardized. And that is one of the issues that we address within the work that I do at LGBT Foundation. And also, I don't know how it is within the States, but within the UK, the legal parameters within the UK, but also within a European perspective, the definitions around identifying as trans are maybe different to what people think they are. And so that can also affect population size as well. But there isn't at present within the UK a standard metric for officially gauging numbers. So that's talking from a UK perspective. Within an LDS context, I definitely have noticed a greater amount of people either in conversations or individually saying to me, oh, I identify as LGBT, or yeah, my brother identifies as LGBT, or everyone seems to have a friend, a relative, or someone within their close sphere that identifies as LGBT. But where do LGBT people go? Are they supported? Particularly within the church, seems to be a different conversation and a different narrative entirely to just how many people identify as LGBT. Does that make sense?
That does make sense.
Yeah.
So you had this experience growing up in your ward, and then you served a mission, and it's kind of the story of how you connected with LGBT, and obviously your graduate work was a big part of that. Any other experiences either on your mission? I know you talked about RISE before we went live. I don't know if you want to talk to our listeners about that, but just kind of your journey as you just learn more about our LGBTQ friends.
Yeah, so growing up in the ward that I did, and with the experience that I had, certainly with the other youth that was there, that was fundamental, because I saw them and the ward saw them transition not only from male to female, but child to adulthood through a variety of different means. So some were social, so starting to use male pronouns and, a more masculine name or a different name, right through to seeing them, having surgeries and mastectomies, taking hormones, voice changes. So really seeing them transition, and again, seeing how that impacted the ward. So I gave an example of, there not being clarity around the discussion, but right through to things like, I remember being in meetings and people saying, well, when this individual transitions to male, should they have the priesthood? Should they be allowed to use male toilets? Should they, be entitled to X, Y, and Z, which are privileges or roles that we normally ascribe to the men? Should they be allowed to go on young men's camps? Should they be allowed to attend young men's rather than young women's? And seeing how the ward responded to those questions, how leaders responded to those questions, and how the individual appeared to respond and take on that experience, and how they then navigated that situation as well. So that formed, a good 13 years of my life, and particularly within those formative experiences. When I was on my mission, there wasn't, at least I'm not aware of coming across or serving with or teaching anyone that identified as LGBT, but they may have done. But I certainly saw my experience on my mission or people that I was working with as just recognizing that there are a diverse range of experiences, a diverse range of lifestyles, and being able to maybe accept that that diversity, and understanding the need to love individuals regardless of whatever their difference was from me. And that was sometimes hard to explain to perhaps companions that were not culturally from a similar background to me, or maybe had grown up in Utah where they, only knew the church, and the church being a heavy part of their life and their culture and nothing else, and perhaps weren't exposed to as much diversity as I had been. But it didn't come up, if I'm honest, on my mission significantly. And so I wouldn't have predicted at that point in my life that I would be working where I am now, because it didn't seem to flow into that experience, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense.
So it really was when I came back and I moved to Edinburgh, and I was in Edinburgh ward, and as I moved into the ward, someone else moved into the ward, and they identified as trans, and again was hit with all of these questions, not myself questioning, but other members of the ward saying, well, should this person be allowed to pass the sacrament? Should they be allowed to teach the youth as a Sunday school teacher? How do they navigate, which classes they go in, and being able to be in a unique position of this sense of, oh, I've been here before. These questions aren't unfamiliar to me, and perhaps navigating some circumstances now are not unfamiliar to me. In fact, I felt confident with them, but having to then support members in the ward, or YSA specifically, that had questions around that and didn't know how to respond, and didn't know how to navigate the questions that they were then facing in terms of, as we were saying before, gender being eternal, and the proclamation, and someone in the middle saying, I believe in the church, but for all intents and purposes, maybe to others it appears that their actions are incongruent with those beliefs. And so that was an interesting year to be navigating that, and obviously being a YSA rep meant I was people's first port of call, and having to navigate a lot of those situations sensitively, while trying to support the individual themselves identified as trans and those within my immediate sphere. So I feel like that linked my experiences growing up, and my experiences growing up then prepared me, I guess, for being in that situation, because I was the only one, as far as I was aware, within the ward that had any awareness of trans people and any experience of trans people within an LDS context.
How did your ward handle some of those things as far as a transgender person, and what class, what restrooms, if they could teach? Any specific examples of how your ward handled that, or was it just any thoughts on that?
So, do you mean in the ward when I was growing up, or when I was in Edinburgh?
Edinburgh ward.
In Edinburgh ward, so it was tricky. So I think the bishop, I really admired the bishop. The bishop at the time was a wonderful man, and he was very aware of the sensitivity of the situation, and also aware of kind of his lack of knowledge on the subject, and also how to best navigate that. And he was quite open. I went to him on a couple of occasions and said, look, I want to know what this policy says and this policy, because people are asking, and I want to have the right language. And, sometimes he'd be like, there's no information on it. There's no policy on it. I've got no guidance on it. He was very transparent. And I think that helped everyone, in the sense that they were able to see there's no particular bias here from the bishop, that we're all working from a position of not as much knowledge and not as much support within an LDS context as people perhaps would like, or as there might be in other situations within the church that arise. So I think that helped. I mean, there are general things such as, allowing individuals to use the disabled toilet rather than a gendered toilet if they would like. The YSA within the ward decided to send an email to everyone stating what names they would like to use and pronouns, and ask people to respect that. So that was a very clear way of enabling people to know what that individual wanted, rather than guessing or making an assumption or misgendering the individual. But it did cause issues when we're starting to, or some members of the ward I know were unhappy with the prospect of this individual who would be turning up to church wearing a skirt and pearls and, bras and things like that. And then in theory, should they be allowed to pass the sacrament or not? And that was, something that I know the bishop dealt with confidentially with families that had those questions. So I guess if there are leaders listening to this, allow your members the space to come and disclose concerns that they may have. You probably don't have the answers for them, and you may not even feel confident in what answers to give them, and that may even cause you to not want to have the conversation. But if they feel that they can be open and transparent and go to you, that will be fundamental in developing that trust and that support, rather than someone not being able to turn to you. And the bishop was very open to learning. So, the individual that identified as trans, they sent the bishop lots of different articles so the bishop could, be aware of different things that they were experiencing or feeling, terminology, and the bishop seemed to have a willingness to learn as well, and recognize that their willingness to learn was not saying they didn't believe in the church or that they didn't have a testimony, or even saying that they agreed with some of the things that the individual might have said or done, but actually learning about the topic enabled them to be a better support, to be a better leader, to be a better bishop, to answer those questions and to listen to those questions with more sincerity, and to really see what the experience was of the individual that identified as trans, and how the environments that they were in within the church impacted them and their well-being, their sense of safety and who they were, and their validity in some senses. So I think they were instrumental in doing that. And I think having the experiences that I had, I was able to mirror a lot of those actions in how I navigated the situation with the young single adults. So it meant that if there were people that maybe didn't want to go to the bishop, or didn't have time or didn't feel comfortable going to the bishop, they could, maybe disclose that information to me, and I could say, well, actually, maybe you should speak to the bishop about it, or just having that safe space to disclose information and say, actually, I have these questions. It's not that it's shaking my testimony or it's cause for concern, but I don't know how to vocalize these questions, and I don't know where to go, and I don't know how to best support this person within our group, So having that support across the ward, I think, was important.
This is really a very thoughtful answer, Claire, and I love your answer. One of the reminds me of Ben Shalati here in Salt Lake City. He's gay and active in the church, and he's had a lot of bishops. He's come out to a lot of bishops. But one of his recent bishops, when he came out to him, the bishop said, "What do I need to learn to serve you better?" And it was just such a humble, thoughtful question. It's really what your advice is to the bishop, and what that bishop did in Edinburgh was say, I need to learn. Sometimes I think we think as bishops we have to have all the answers, and I think there's a spiritual component of being a bishop where you get revelation from God and inspiration from God from your members, but just like we have to get personal revelation, we have to study it out in our mind and learn all we can to be able to to open our hearts to the revelation that we should receive for a member. And part of that is learning. And so I love the principles of that, and it's complicated. And, sometimes I think, how do you handle these questions? Because I think some people, I maybe do this, want to keep everything in this nice, tidy box. And so when something comes along as a transgender person that kind of stretches our box or causes us to be a little uncomfortable or stretch, we want to then put it back in the nice, tidy box by saying, well, that's just the influence of Satan and his latest, ways to attack the family. Or people would say, well, there weren't trans people 100 years or 200 years ago, so this isn't really real. And this is just the decline of society or the increased role of Satan fighting against the family. And those are maybe really thoughtful, legitimate thoughts that come out of traditional LDS people. How do you handle some of those comments?
I think for me personally, I first try to assess, is the question, is the comment sincere, or is it with a bias? Is it agendered? If someone is coming to me and they want to have a legitimate conversation about, let's say, trans people and non-binary identities and the existence of those identities within the world, within the Western world and the non-Western world, they want to authentically have that conversation. I'm happy to engage that conversation with them. And, we can discuss that from a variety of angles, and I can signpost them to articles and things like that. But if they're coming without that sincerity, and actually it's to force their opinion or to attack me or another individual, and it's not really coming from a place of genuine, sincere learning, then to be honest, I don't have time for that. And I'm quite clear about shutting that down very quickly, because I think we live in a world where we're bombarded with information, and all information is biased. You can't escape your bias, but you can acknowledge it, and you can try not to have such a biased opinion on things, so that you can really see a wider range of perspectives. So I think that's one of the first things that I'm always quite clear on is this conversation, is this question coming from a place of sincerity or not? Because only if we're sincere do I think we can really have a meeting of hearts and minds and understandings and intent, and a real learning exchange where I'm learning from the individual and they're learning from me, and we're both going away from that. Maybe not with all the answers, but certainly, a sense of connecting together and further resources for where we can go and learn. I also think it's important that we recognize that just because someone's having these questions, or if you are having those questions yourself, and trying to reconcile these ideas, that's not necessarily a reflection of your worthiness or your testimony, or that you're doing something wrong. So, for example, when I was writing my dissertation, I had to read lots of different articles and books on a range of topics that, I wouldn't, probably not of my initial choosing, but I had to because they related to my dissertation and my caseload. And so sometimes members of the church in passing would ask, well, what did you do today? And I would say, I'm reading this article about, X, Y, Z. And they would say, why are you reading, why are you reading that? Have you got an issue with your testimony? Like, are you questioning things? You shouldn't read things like that. And I would explain it's for my dissertation. And then they would say, you're forced to read it for your academic course. So you wouldn't honestly look at these things yourself. You're forced to read them. Okay, well, if you're forced to read them, we understand why you're reading them, but you must be uncomfortable. So even within that, the individual is assuming that if I'm engaging in that conversation or educating myself on a particular topic that is outside the mainstream of the church beliefs, that it must be a reflection of my worthiness or my testimony, and it wasn't. And then the presumption that, oh, I must be forced because I wouldn't choose to educate myself on that topic unless I was forced to, or I identified as LGBT. And so I think that's something that is often sometimes used within conversations that we have within our wards or members of the church, that we have to be mindful of. Not that those opinions come, I don't think anyone that shared those thoughts with me were coming from a place of negative intent, but their solution was, well, you just ignore it and then it goes away. And actually, if you ignore something, it doesn't go away. It maybe gets buried a little bit deeper, but it will resurface at some point in another example in a few years' time. And then, you know, almost like those whack-a-moles, you kind of push it down for a little bit and then it'll pop up somewhere else. You'll push it down, you know, and I can't think of the exact quote off the top of my head, but Freud talks about, you know, if there is an unresolved conflict, it's destined to be manifest if we don't address it. And I'm wildly paraphrasing because I don't have the quote in front of me. But I feel that sometimes within the church, not just with questions relating to LGBT communities, but a variety of other questions that we may have, questions of the soul within the church, that sometimes there is this fear that by out identifying it and vocalizing it and looking into it, that we put ourselves in a vulnerable position and we would be better off to stay uneducated on the topic. And I don't think that's useful for anyone, because then it means when these topics are becoming more mainstream, we're not equipped with the language and the ability and the confidence to have the conversations openly and transparently, and we're left doing a disservice to the individuals that are in the firing line, that are experiencing pain. And also as a community, it doesn't give the best impression of us being inclusive and engaging and proactive and aware and knowledgeable and all those kind of things. So I think both of those points are important. Can you just ask your question again, just to make sure I've not gone off on a tangent?
No, you answered the question really well. It's just sort of, people that think this is a decline of society or Satan. And I love the way you said you want to figure out the intent behind the question. And if someone's already has a decision made, that's different to engaging with somebody who really wants to learn. And I've certainly had to create those boundaries. And do you find that people, are suspicious of you, that you don't pass the purity test as a Latter-day Saint because you're, have a job, your career now is in this space? Or do you find that that's just kind of an individual basis, that you get a lot of support and some that ask questions or just talk? Because there's a lot of allies out there. This might be for other allies that are saying, I'm a faithful Latter-day Saint and I want to use my baptism covenants to actually minister to a group of people that has a harder road. And that seems to be the gospel of Jesus Christ. But yet sometimes people that do that are held in suspicion or don't pass a purity test within our church. And so how are you navigating that? And are you feeling in that? Because here you are in a Relief Society president in a ward, and you also have a career with this foundation. So just share with our listeners some of your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think it is definitely hard. There are parts where I feel that I need to remember what I believe and who I believe, and as long as I know that, it's kind of irrelevant. I'll share an experience with you, and hopefully it will give a bit more context. But when I was first doing my placement in Edinburgh, I had to go for it was kind of like an introductory interview and discussion. And I went in the day, and in the evening I went to Institute, and I was YSA rep at the time, and the other YSA rep, the male YSA rep, was this guy. And I'll be honest, I fancied him like crazy. I had a mad crush on this guy, and really, really liked him, really admired him. He was faithful and active in the church and had a good testimony, and we were both YSA reps, so we were working together and seeing each other at church quite a lot. And so we were very close. And I was at Institute, and he said to me, "Oh, what have you done today?" And I explained I went to this interview at this LGBT Health Centre, and he physically recoiled in shock. And he said, "Oh, I didn't think you were, I mean, are you, so are you kind of, and I could see he was struggling for these words, and he was uncomfortable. And, and he said, "Oh, what are you doing there?" And I remember in this moment, as I'm watching his reaction to me just even saying that I had been in this environment, I remember feeling sad. I remember feeling frustrated. I remember feeling angry. I remember wanting to be defensive and say, because I fancied this guy, I didn't want him to think that I was gay and therefore wasn't a possible person he could date. And I remember wanting to defend that. But I said nothing. And I remember, almost as instantly as I wanted to defend it, I remember thinking, what does this matter? And so he kind of said, "Oh, what are you, why are you there?" And I'll be honest, I didn't really handle it very well. And I said, "I'm there to help people." And I walked out of the room, and I went to the toilet, and I was really kind of emotional. It took me a while to compose myself. And as I was there, I was thinking, what is it about just even vocalizing that I was in this environment that to others feels threatening, that to others feels that who I am as they have known me must now be different, must now have changed, must now be controversial, must now be whatever the end of that sentence is. And that sense of, I remember thinking, oh, I want to defend that and almost say, well, I'm not this and I'm not that, and reassure, and at the same time thinking, actually, none of their questions are relevant because I know how I identify, and I know that I'm a worthy temple holder, and I know that Jesus Christ is my Saviour, and I believe that, and I know that I am actively keeping my temple covenant. So actually, if they're going to make an assumption around anything to do with me and my identity and my worthiness, that's down to them. That's not down to me, because I know that I'm keeping my covenants, and I know I can answer those temple questions, honestly and clearly, and that's reflected in my service. And so there are definitely times since then where I've had similar experiences where people have made assumptions, and I have had to rely on, just I know who I am, and I know what I believe, and I know what's important to me. And if they want to make assumptions, that's up to them. And other times I've, had to clarify what they may have thought about me. And sometimes I've had to almost justify my standing. So when there have been 2 times that I have required a renewal of my temple recommend, for example, and on both occasions they have been with a member of the state presidency, the second interview that you have, and in both occasions they've been with members of the state presidency that I have never met before. And so coming in cold and them asking me, is there anything that you anything in your life that's not in accordance with the church or against the standards of the church, and them perhaps knowing or having asked what I do for work, almost sometimes having to justify to them, actually, this is what my work involves, this is what my testimony of the church is, and I don't see that the two are incongruent or incompatible. And and I've been fortunate that in both cases those temple recommend interview ended in a way where there was that meeting of minds and intent and understanding, but they provoke anxiety because I know that depending on the person's individual perspective or experience or biases, they will perceive me positively or negatively as an ally or as someone that could be, living contrary to the church or supporting things that are contrary to the church's primary beliefs and teaching. So it can be quite a hard situation to navigate, and it's been I've had to kind of toughen up about some assumptions that people may make, and just, but in other cases, people knowing the environment that I work in means that a lot of people actually come and disclose information to me, or see actually if this person is working in an area that is unique and is different, maybe they're open to discussing a variety of different situations, and people will often come and disclose things to me, not even about their sexual orientation or their gender identity, but other questions that they have about the church that they don't feel safe disclosing to other members or friends and family. And so we're able to have that conversation, that friendship, because of the environment that I work in. It's an immediate sign to them that maybe I don't fit the mainstream, but you can still be active and working and living within an environment that's different and not the norm.
Those are great examples. And, on behalf of our listeners, I love the way you're navigating this space. I do believe strongly in my heart, Clare, that what you're doing is consistent with the gospel of Jesus Christ, that he was with those that had a harder road in mortality, and that's the way I see my baptism covenants, is going horizontal, a big part of it, and that's my relationship with other people and lifting other people's burdens. So I think and it is kind of a difficult space. Some would look at that as not, and so I think you're managing that really well. But one of the things that strikes me, I keep reminding myself, you're only in your 20s, late 20s. You have obvious academic and intelligence and a framework that's very, very helpful, and a deep foundation in the church. And all this comes together to form, your unique ministry, both within your presidency and your ward in Warrington, and with your work at the LGBT Foundation. And you're just serving a lot of people in both spaces. And I hope that you feel the balm of Gilead around you from our faith community for what you're doing. And as we mature as a faith, that we aren't suspicious of somebody like you. And I've shared this story with some of our listeners, but if others are listening for the first time, and it's about my own mission president. When we came to England, right before he got there, he felt the culture was too much us versus the Church of England. And the prior mission president really needed a bogeyman or an enemy. And he thought that if we made the Church of England the bad guy, that it would help take our message to the people of Northwest England. And our mission president, Ellis Ivory, thought, no, that keeps us from taking the good news of our gospel. And he wanted to break the culture. So he had an all-mission conference in the Lake District in Hawkshead, which is near Kendal. And I don't know if you know where Hawkshead is. And we all went to a Church of England there, and the vicar and the mission president spoke to us sitting in that Church of England. And we just talked about the common ground we had in the gospel of Jesus Christ. And what happened is it just fundamentally changed the culture of our mission. We no longer had to talk negatively about the Church of England. We could have a fact-based discussion about the Church of England without demonizing them, and our baptisms just soared. We actually became the top English-speaking baptizing mission in the whole church, with over 300 a month being baptized in that area that you live in. And it just taught me that I don't need to demonize other people to sort of build my religion up. I don't need to demonize LGBTQ people to somehow validate my straight marriage. And even people that leave, I just don't see them as the villain. I see ISIS as the villain, and people that sell children into sex trafficking as the villain. And I think we're just maturing as a church and a culture to see people as fellow human beings, and and have a more thoughtful heart that allows us to see differences. And just a closing note on that, Hawkshead Church of England is one of our missionaries came back 20 years later, about 3 years ago, and saw they were doing a fundraiser for the Tower Bell. And he contacted the person doing a fundraiser, and all of our missionaries that went to that were extended the courtesy. In 1979, we raised about 20,000 pounds and presented it to that church near Kendal. And the new mission president and the new vicar were there in the Czech presentation. I just love that, where we came together in our common humanity to support each other. And we didn't sell out our religion to do that. We just used our very religion to find common ground with our fellow humans. So that was just helpful for me. But I realize I have a lot more privilege than you do. You're 29 and younger and female, and so you may be held up to more suspicion than I am at 58 and male and married and have 6 kids. And so I felt some of the feelings you may have felt, but I just admire the strength and courage you have and your convictions, both in our church and your work. And to me, it's not a conflict. And I think more and more people are coming to the same conclusions you are. I know when I just said some nice things in social media as a YSA bishop, that it stunned me how many people then, just like for you, said, okay, I'm not LGBTQ, but I can talk to this guy. He's safe to talk to about my faith or a difficult thing that happened. And it was fascinating to me. If we want to create a culture of safety in our personal lives or in our local congregations, being kind to marginalized people, that should be easy to do, but it often sends a message that we're safe, which is, I think, a great pastoral principle. So anyway, and the only other mission story I'll tell, Claire, because I'm reminiscing now, is my very first companion when I was in Ashton over in Manchester Stake. He was British, and his name's David Rutley. And he said in the early part of our companionship, he said, someday I'm going to be a member of Parliament. And I kind of rolled my eyes. And then after spending 2 months with David Rutley, I said to myself, he's going to be a member of Parliament. And sure enough, David Rutley is a current member of Parliament, representing Macclesfield, and continues to be a great friend, a great member of the church, and doing great good. And it was just one of your that's the only famous politician I know, Claire, is one of your members of Parliament. But let's circle back, because we're kind of coming to the end of this podcast. Talk about the work you do at the LGBT Foundation, if I'm naming it correctly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the project that I'm on is a project called Pride in Practice, and we deliver training to healthcare professionals on the specific needs of LGBT people. So we look at possible barriers that LGBT people may have in accessing healthcare. So that could be anything from previous negative experiences. It could be looking at if they've got, internalized homophobia, because within England, homosexual activity was criminalized until 1967. And even in 1967, it was only partially decriminalized. So you still have lots of people that are still alive that grew up being told there's something wrong with them and because of who they're attracted to, that it was a criminal act, so they're bad people, there's something suspicious about them, etc. And ultimately that can affect how open how open people are in certain environments because of how safe they feel if they've internalized that homophobia. So we look at some barriers like that. We look at some logistical barriers as well that people may have in accessing healthcare. And so one example is looking at cervical screening within this country. Cisgender women are advised to go for cervical screening every 3 years, but if you identify as a trans man, you may still have a cervix, but our system, the actual IT structural system of our healthcare service means that you would be missed from any recalls and any letters and information inviting you for a cervical smear. So potentially you might never go, and you might have cervical cancer, and by the time it's diagnosed, it's too late. So we address some of those systematic issues that are there, and things that individual practices can put in place. We look at health qualities and prevalence rates. So LGBT communities have higher prevalence rates of smoking, substance use, whether that's drugs or alcohol or smoking, certain phenomena that relate to that. Sexual health is often a risky area for LGBT communities. Obviously, HIV prevalence rates are higher amongst certain LGBT communities. So we discuss that, and we discuss things that people can put in place to support individuals that are accessing their services. So it can feel a little bit overwhelming at times as you start to realise that the political and certainly within the UK, the social healthcare system that we have, that I've grown up feeling very proud of, actually has huge loopholes that is not meeting the needs of many minority communities, not just LGBT communities, but looking to support individual services in understanding the needs of others. And I think that's something that we need to recognise that if someone's had a negative experience relating to any part of their identity, they're less likely to feel comfortable disclosing information about themselves in other environments. So often I'll go to a doctor's surgery and they'll say, well, we treat everyone the same, and if someone's got something relevant to their healthcare needs that is related to their sexual orientation or their gender identity, they'll let us know. But actually, if you face years of discrimination or fear or stigma because of your sexual orientation or your gender identity or your religion or your belief or whatever factor it may be, you're less likely to disclose information. And so I think at present, the onus is on the individual to identify and explain why their sexual orientation is important and how it impacts their life, why their gender identity is important and how it impacts their life. And actually what we need to be developing is a connecting of hearts and minds where the leaders within healthcare, the individuals within healthcare are saying, I have some knowledge, I have some awareness, I think this is how it might impact you, but let's have a real authentic conversation about you and your situation. Who's important to you? Is your significant other, the same gender or a different gender? Am I making assumptions about that gender that means you don't feel comfortable disclosing that information? And actually having that real conversation of trying to support and help one another. And I think that's a principle that we can take into whatever environment we are working in, actually, is that by having these conversations, you're only going to improve and learn and have a greater understanding of the reality of some people's lives, the reality that is probably different from your life, and maybe you can't, until having that conversation, fully fathom. But the conversation needs to be had to get you out of your own bubble and to see actually life is far more multifaceted than we acknowledge. And it's important to help people to feel validated and authentic as themselves. So, I mean, that's kind of the maybe the fluffier side of my work compared to the day-to-day tasks of, trying to liaise with policymakers and, healthcare committees and governing committees and targets and things like that. But really at the core of it, it's helping people to try and achieve their fullest potential and helping those leaders and healthcare professionals that can support them to feel confident in meeting their needs. Because at the minute, so many people are not having their needs met within the system. So,
do your co-workers know you're a Latter-day Saint? And if they do, does that surprise them that you're in this space and an active Christian?
They do know that I'm a member of the church, yes, and they do know that I'm active. Some of my colleagues are more perhaps comfortable with that, so they'll ask me about which conventions I've been to on the weekends, and have I found anyone, am I still single, and things like that. And so in that sense, the conversation isn't much different from conversations that other members of the church might be having with me, even though the environment's different. But they do know that I'm a member of the church, and I think that's important for people to know, because we often, I think we presume that because some identities, or at least what's portrayed in the media, is portrayed that you can't be a member of faith, a person of faith, and LGBT, that the two are incompatible, that you must be one or the other, right? And so actually by saying, well, I am an active member of my religion, but I also recognize this is, an area that I feel very strongly connected to and have experience with and want to work in and support LGBT people, that actually that is a great strength, because I can see different angles and different sides, and I'm not shy about acknowledging that I have a faith and that I'm active within that faith, and that helps to break down those stereotypes that you must choose one or the other. And actually the reality is that we are often living with multiple intersecting factors to our identity and to our existence. So this shouldn't be any different, but we're often told that it should be in the media, that it's not possible for people to have a faith and be LGBT, and that, I think that's rubbish. My manager at work, we get on really well. They identify as LGBT and they're a Buddhist, and we often have conversations about religion and how our faiths intersect, and the personal work that I'm doing with Rise and other personal things. So no, it's definitely important that they know, and it's valued. It feels valued and acknowledged within my work environment. I'm really grateful for that, because I know that there may be other people that don't have working environments where they can be open and transparent and feel safe. So
I love that answer, and I love that. I'm thinking some of the Brene Brown, that we can be everywhere, and it doesn't. And you're in these multiple spaces, and I love the way you're just owning that and helping people in both spaces to realize you can do both. And I think it's a sign of spiritual maturity, emotional maturity, and seeing our society as all human beings. And I think it's what Christ did. I look at his ministry and I look at what you're doing, and to me, it's consistent, and it is the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I think you're helping so many people. Are there just any last thoughts you'd like to share before we close, Clare?
I don't think so, which I feel is a faux pas. I feel like I should always have a last word, or a final punchy comment. But I think, there's so much more that we could delve into in these topics. If we had a couple of days to sit around the fire and unpick them and unpack them a little bit, it would be great. But I think just something that I would want people to remember is, if you are struggling with your sexual orientation, or you're struggling with your gender identity, it's okay. And I don't know your situation, so I don't know whether it's safe to disclose that information or to be open. So I don't want to, placate you with a sentence that is, so generalized that it has no meaning. But you are not the only one, and I think for anyone that's having those questions, whether they identify as LGBT or not, and questioning things within the gospel, it's okay to question. When you're questioning, it's not a reflection necessarily of your faith or your testimony or your worthiness. And I think that's something that for many years, I was quite bolshy and quite confident growing up, but I still recognized I was nervous if I sat in a young women's meeting and, if someone brought up the law of chastity, was there an assumption that you were bringing it up because you had an issue with it? Or if you were bringing up sexual orientation, were you bringing it up because you had an issue with it? And I think sometimes that narrative still lingers within the conversations that we have at church and within the structures of the church culture. And we need to do everything we can to get away from that, because while we are making people feel bad for questioning, we're not loving them. And I think sometimes we have this thought that we have the monopoly on truth, and therefore if we're telling them the truth, then it's fine. And actually my mission president would tell us truth without love destroys. Wow. It doesn't matter if your message is true. If you don't love the individual, you'll do more damage than you will good. And actually we need to love each other. And that can feel really hard, and that can sometimes feel irreconcilable. But if we continue to perpetuate situations where people feel that they are wrong for questioning, for having thoughts, for even, reading an article about LGBT communities and making the assumption that they'd only read it if they were forced to, or if they had an issue with, then we're contributing more to the problem than we'll ever be helping. And unless you love the person, the truth will, truth without love does destroy. So I think that's the only thing that, if anyone listens to this and they come away just feeling actually it's okay to question, it's okay to have those thoughts, and that you're not bad for having them, because if they're coming from a place of sincerity, from really wanting to work out, where you stand in relation to the gospel and the Saviour, that's fine. If they're coming from a sincere place, those questions are okay. And I don't want to open myself up to be, to being too vulnerable, but if you want to share my contact details, or people want to get in touch following this podcast, that's fine.
Are you okay sharing your email address with our listeners?
Yeah, exactly. You can share that.
Why don't you just will you give your email? Will you go ahead and just read it for our listeners?
Yeah, camarshall@hotmail.co.uk. You can email me if you want, and I think it's just being able to know that there's someone else that's an ally or a bridge or an outlet where you can just say, hey, I'm having these questions, and I'm not necessarily going to have the answers on them, but I think we need to create more spaces where people can feel safe to say, I have questions about X, Y, Z, whether it's, sexual orientation or word of wisdom or pornography or whatever it is within the church. We need to create safe spaces, because without them, we will struggle, and we will continue to perpetuate negative cycles of shame and of guilt that potentially can be avoided. So I think that's all I can share at the end, and hopefully it doesn't sound too corny, and is the intents of my thoughts are coming over, hopefully, the voice waves.
That's great, Claire. Thank you, Clare Marshall, active Latter-day Saint, supporter of LGBTQ people, disciple of Christ, British citizen with an awesome accent, for joining us on another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love. And I just pray you'll continue to be sustained. You have a beautiful and unique life mission, and you are helping hundreds and hundreds of people. So thank you, Claire. And this is Richard Osler signing off on another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love.